Hi, everyone, and welcome to the very first edition of a new series called Rare Conversations. Here we are digging in with different experts from the environmental field who are really pushing the frontiers of what it means to be doing this work right now by bringing in insights from the behavioral sciences as well as other disciplines. I am Madhuri Karak, the community engagement lead at RARE's Center for Behavior and the Environment. And today, I am joined by the very, very special Sarah Stein Greenberg. She is the executive director of Stanford University's D.school, and we're just so excited to have you, Sarah. Welcome.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here today.
Good morning, should I say? You're joining us from the San Francisco Bay Area, but now it seems like you're in the bottom of an ocean.
Yes, my background is actually, this is my happy place. This is where I would like to be all the time. I took this picture in Indonesia a few years ago, actually, and this is a great example of what a really beautiful, healthy reef looks like, right? Where people have come together at a policy level, at a local level, and figured out strategies to really protect the environment. So I'm never tired of showing off this gorgeous reefscape.
I think many of our audience members might be thinking this. What is that tiny little, is it a turtle? Is it a fish? The one with the yellow halo around it? What is it?
Yeah, that is a kind of butterfly fish that I don't know the specific species of, but you have now made me more determined to look that up and identify that. So thanks for the push. I'll take off the background because I can see that there's a piece of coral right above my head that sort of looks like an awkward hat.
Any of you scuba divers in the audience and know what that fish is, drop it in the chat. We all want to know. So Sarah, I know design thinking, but in case we have folks in the audience who are a little bit like, design, is that Silicon Valley, technology, interior design? Why don't you just clear the air and start off with design thinking, what it is, what's the D.school, what is its mission, and what do you do there?
Fantastic. Great place to start. So I will just give like the briefest possible history of how we think about and talk about design at the D.school, because it is a fairly new way of thinking about what design is. So the D.school got started a little over 15 years ago. And at that time, I mean, the prevailing kind of social conception of what design was definitely, it's about the interior, or it's about the kind of aesthetic qualities of an object, an artifact, something physical that you might make. And around that time, and even a little bit earlier, there had begun a shift in how particularly companies were starting to use design to think about earlier in the process of developing a new product or service, how you could actually adopt some of the strategies that designers use routinely to make things more appealing and actually more useful to people who might potentially buy them or use them. And as that started happening, it became important to start to describe all of those ways that designers work in language that could be used across organizations. So this concept of design thinking really came out of that era. And it became a kind of common vocabulary that people from many different disciplinary backgrounds could use. And fundamentally, it means really raising the importance of the human experience in the process of developing new ideas and focusing more on that than thinking about like, oh, we've invented this new technology, how might we promote that? It's really about finding out and understanding from the human perspective what the needs are that might be served by different kinds of approaches or different kinds of technologies. And one of the things that happens at the D.school is that we are kind of an unusual institute in the heart of Stanford University. in that we are able to include students from all different kinds of backgrounds in our programs. So we have students who are enrolled in the business school, in all different kinds of engineering, but also in the medical school, in the School of Earth, Energy, and the Environment, in the law school. And so we get this incredibly rich interdisciplinary mixture of students. And when those students come together around a project, they look at it in a really unique way. And they use the language of design to figure out, how do we understand the opportunities here? What might we design around the problem that we're trying to solve, whether that's an environmental problem, whether that's a problem, like, for example, we had a group of students this year designing around financial solutions for people who had experienced a natural disaster. And they're working with banks and they're working with financial experts, but they're also working with the communities who have experienced wildfires or other kinds of disasters. That kind of project doesn't have a clear, obvious set of answers. And so the design process becomes the way that the students explore and learn more about what might be most useful to the people who are having those challenges.
Right. And, for the audience, to give you all an example of design thinking at work right now, this minute, couple of students of Sarah's, in fact, are working with Rare Columbia's agronomists and behavioral scientists in our Lands for Life program. And, the sort of goal for that program is really to improve agricultural productivity of smallholder farmers, but also promote ecosystems resilience. And it's just been so fascinating to watch how designers and agronomists are tackling this problem of how to really distill technical expertise in a way that is accessible and simple and sustainable for these farmers, right? Because questions like, how much nitrogen to put into my soil, right? How much is too much compost? When should I irrigate? And, these questions aren't exactly, me standing in front of my stove making aglio olio and I'm thinking, how much garlic to put into my olive oil? And the answer to that is always a lot, right? And so how designers and agronomists are sort of creating these mechanisms of, be it record keeping, be it self-monitoring, where, the program's aim has now quickly become making doubt a thing of the past. And so that really brings me to your work in Ambiguity, right? I don't know if you'll agree if I call Ambiguity maybe doubt's younger sibling or less smarmy sibling, I don't know. But what do you think design and design thinking, particularly as a lens, has to really contribute to grappling with ambiguity specifically?
Yeah. So this topic is so central to design. And I think it's so central to all of us at a moment when we're experiencing a world in which there is so much ambiguity and so much uncertainty about what's going on. So let's talk about that onion project, for example. So the project in Columbia is a partnership between the folks on the Rare team there and a few of our students who are trying to figure out, how do we help farmers, many of whom are actually new to onion farming, choose more sustainable organic compost, really, that's the ultimate goal, so that the overall environmental picture in the region isn't damaged, the waterways aren't damaged. And that requires a whole different set of behaviors and choices that farmers would need to make to really move the needle. So there are so many different ways that you can approach that. The design way is to start by really understanding, what do these farmers need? What do they care about? How do they already make decisions? And one of the things that we always find is that people who have great expertise tend to see the world through their own lens. So an agronomist is going to see it in a certain kind of way around, like, the right ratio of fertilizer for this particular crop and the ideal yield and the time frame. And that might be really far away from how a farmer views their priorities and their way of making decisions. It might be more based on cost. It might be more based on what their neighbor does or the cultural practices that they have learned from other places. So there's always more than one way to look at and understand a challenge. And there's always more than one solution, right? So design is fantastic when you're tackling challenges that don't have an obvious answer. And that's where ambiguity comes in. So ambiguity really means like more than one interpretation can be true, more than one solution is possible. And that is really unsettling and uncomfortable, often for people who have a lot of expertise, because we're used to and we're really trained to like know the right answer and to bring that from like the kind of single point of view that we've been trained in. And so there are so many challenges right now in the world, and conservation is full of them, where we don't know all the right answers. There's not an obvious solution to the question, how do we help farmers be part of the community effort to sustain the health of the land in Colombia or in anywhere else, or the oceans in Indonesia? There are many answers and many different parts of that solution. And so when we embark on a design project in any of those spaces, we have to remain open to the idea that we don't know the right answer at the beginning. There is no one right answer. And we need a set of strategies for dealing with the ambiguity in a technical way and in an emotional way. The technical way that we work with ambiguity in design is we recognize it. We actually embrace it, because if the answer is obvious at the beginning, it is very unlikely that you are going after something that is innovative. And so we look for work actually where those answers aren't obvious. And we use a set of strategies like being able to say, we're going to carry multiple ideas at once, and we're going to experiment on those different ideas. We often call those prototypes. So we'll have like, okay, we've got prototype A and prototype B and prototype C. We're going to test all of those and get feedback from the people that we're trying to partner with. And that's actually going to help us inform our direction. And frankly, what I see from my students is that is a very, very different way of working than most of them are being taught in their formal disciplines around law or business or engineering. So that's the kind of very practical approach that design teaches us, that allows us to encounter ambiguity and to not be paralyzed by it.
Right, and I think, the elephant in the virtual room is that we are all working from home. We have been spending too much time with our housemates, our children, our family. And perhaps this is making us empathetic to ambiguity, right, as a challenge, particularly in the environmental space, as something that we are now physically embodying and in the middle of, right? So questions like, when are we going back to the office? I don't know. When am I going to be able to jump on a plane to see my family in India? I don't know, right? And I think this classificatory framework that you have developed in the D.school around how to really parse how different folks are approaching these challenges of ambiguity is just so fascinating to me. So will you share how that framework came to be, and then what the 3 different types?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So, so we have been fascinated by ambiguity, as I said, at the D.school, because we see the development of a tolerance for or a comfort with ambiguity as really crucial to our students' development. And so we have always in our pedagogy found ways to preserve ambiguity within the learning experiences at the D.school, but we realized that we could do a better job of helping our students have a language for understanding how they personally relate to working with ambiguity. So a few of my colleagues a few years ago, particularly Kelly Schmoody and Seamus Hart, did a project where they interviewed about 150 of our students and developed this set of archetypes that we actually shared with all of you in the audience earlier via that poll. So the idea that we've come across is that we've sort of seen three main ways that people engage with ambiguity. So one is this sense of, I have to endure it. I have to grit my teeth. I want to get out of ambiguity as fast as possible. I want to get to the answer, and then I want to move on. And that feels like you're standing on solid ground. And then there's a group of students and people in general who seem to have a different relationship where they want to engage ambiguity, but kind of selectively. So I would put myself in this category. Like, I like to have some projects in my life that are really open-ended, where I can really exercise like a full range of my creative abilities. Don't know the right answer, little scary, but it's kind of manageable. And then I also like to have some things where I'm more in an execution mode. For me, that's the right balance. But this idea of being able to engage is that you can dive in and kind of take an off-road adventure at times. And then there are some people who just seem to be ambiguity junkies. Like, they want to only work in those crazy amorphous problem spaces. They're the folks in your meetings who like often like don't want to end the conversation because they still want to talk about like all the possibilities. And I guess I would say all of these ways of relating to ambiguity are really helpful to a team, right? And they help you kind of look at a problem very holistically. So I think Stephanie is sharing our poll results right now. So we have a very dominant cluster in the middle around folks who like to engage ambiguity, which is terrific. And if folks in the chat want to share any sort of texture or color in terms of like why you put what you put, that would be super interesting to see. One of the things that we hear a lot is that people tend to have a different approach to ambiguity in their personal or professional lives. So some people seem to really love ambiguity in their professional life, but they want their personal life to be like much more straightforward. And for others, it's the reverse. And I don't think we know exactly what that's about. You might have more of a sense from the behavioral science perspective, because I know that there's a rich literature emerging around kind of ambiguity intolerance, which I think is quite interesting that it's framed in the negative there. But this is I mean, this is an interesting set of results, I think, for all of us to look at. I think it's important to note, like for the folks in this I'll engage area, like ambiguity is both exhilarating and exhausting. And this idea that we're all pretty exhausted right now because of the broader social conditions that we're experiencing is really important to note. I think it's very hard to do your best creative work or to be the best kind of problem solver that you can be when you are feeling exhausted. But it's really nice to see, like, this is the type, I think, that has that balance, right? You can feel that exhilaration that comes from when you are tapping into something that it feels like nobody has addressed before or solved before, and that's an important component too.
I was just thinking while hearing you speak, you know, since the title of our very first Rare Conversations is, you know, innovating for sustainability in this uncertain time, if you could talk a little bit about how ambiguity rubs up with innovation, particularly, you know, since you flagged that, you know, yes, this can be very exhausting. Human beings find it hard to accept that as a species. We don't do good with not knowing things. So where do you think that sort of perfect fit with, okay, things are ambiguous, but I'm going to use this now as a time to be imaginative, to be innovative, to really, you know, get in there? What does that look like, you know, when your students have, you know, gone out into the world and had to face some of these ambiguous contexts? What are some of the insights that, you know, they have come away with when they have engaged with ambiguity as real and present and a variable that needs to be addressed?
Yeah. So I mean, I think that a lot of people, even the people who are in the embrace or engage type, like it is still a challenge, right? So it can be a real struggle. And we hear that a lot, but we also hear students who say like, I'm now in a really ambiguous context. I'm really glad that I have some of those tools to be able to approach it. So we had a conversation recently with someone who took one of our trainings for education leaders. And he is the dean of students at a large college on the East Coast. And he basically, referring to all of the challenges that schools, higher ed and K-12 are facing right now around figuring out what to do in the fall. He said, without having had any design training, I would have just had absolutely no idea how to approach this challenge. He said, now I still don't know exactly what I'm going to do, but I know how I'm going to approach it. And so that's a really good indicator that he has developed a comfort with the set of tools and strategies that we use in design, like multiple carrying parallel prototypes forward, or just really having this articulated vocabulary around, oh, this is an ambiguous type of a problem. I have to remain open in a certain way. That he has carried that away. So that's a beautiful example of, what I would consider a real success. I would say more broadly, the ability to cope with ambiguity as a problem solver, as a creative leader, like could not be more important than it is right now. That's true in conservation. That's true more broadly. And one of my colleagues has a great saying, which is like, nobody took a class in ambiguity, right? That's just not taught. You maybe, if you went to business school, you took like a risk management course, but this idea of how do you selectively invite ambiguity into your process? And also how do you know when to like actually push your solution out into the world? That's something that most of us don't have strong training in. And so that is a really important priority for the D-School, is to figure out how do we get more people to have a set of problem solving tools where they can reliably engage with these kinds of highly ambiguous challenges that we're all facing.
Sarah, I have a question coming in that actually directly is related to what you just said now. Do you have the number of engagers in your student sample? Because we have a member of the audience interested in how the audience fared versus your Stanford student sample.
It's a really great question. I don't have that right in front of me, but we can look that up.
Dig into that later.
Yes.
Okay.
And I will say that we've developed a whole set of materials around this, which we call the Library of Ambiguity. And so there's that study that I mentioned, there's much more detail about what some of the results were. And I think there's quite a few of the like direct quotes from students. So there's more to dig in around that. I would say this is a great profile for this group. But I really want to emphasize what I said before, which is there is no wrong way to engage with ambiguity, but it is very helpful to know and to have a language around how you do relate to it. Often folks who are in the sort of endure camp, like really struggle and are really like experience a lot of stress in a project where there is a lot of ambiguity, but they can serve a really important role on that team in helping the team move forward when the time is right. And knowing when the time is right is that delicate balance. And the folks who are on the embrace side, which I have to say, like I work with a lot of people who have a really formal design training, and they sometimes, like we need to ship the thing, right? We need to finish the project. We need to actually say like, there is no one right solution, but we're gonna push this out into the world regardless. And so all of these qualities are useful at various times. And again, just knowing how you relate to ambiguity is the tool that we're trying to promote, not to say you should try to progress through these different phases.
Right. I like that check that, these types are not sort of a teleology where you have to push yourself to move from one type to the next. So I think that's a useful reminder. But as we, move towards taking in some questions from our audience, I want to pause a little bit. And, we've acknowledged that we are in unprecedented times. This is the global pandemic, not to mention the sort of national reckoning that is underway with systemic social injustice in the United States. And of course, the overarching framework of uncertainty that permeates into everything else, right, which is climate change. And so inhabiting all of this, right, overlapping set of uncertainties as they are, what gives you hope? What makes you wake up every day and show up in your office and do the work?
I mean, my students, hands down, are the number one answer to that. And it's been incredible to be with them during this past several months where, they have really been tested in terms of their ability to navigate this extremely uncertain time. And, they're facing potentially a very difficult job market. Their ideal of like what their college experience or grad school experience has been very disrupted. And despite that, many of them have really dug into the kind of work that we do at the D.school, whether that's working with partners like RARE or on the disaster relief project that I mentioned. And many of them have been protesting or working on racial justice or related issues. And, that really, this generation, a lot of negative stuff is written about them, but they really give me hope. And I think that, it's our role as educators to try to prepare them to deal with, this is a generation of people who we don't even have the language for the kinds of challenges that they are going to have to face over their lifetimes. This is a generation that will have 5 or 6 or 7 different careers, not different jobs, but different careers, which we probably also don't even have the language for. So their ability to be really good at learning how to get better at the problems that are at hand at the time that they are facing them, and to be able to cope with just an unprecedented speed of and level of change throughout their lives that is our responsibility to prepare them for. They seem like they are up for the challenge, which is fantastic. I'll also say that I really have, been very excited, and this was really what drew me to RARE in the first place, by the kind of creative thinking that I'm seeing from folks who are working kind of at this intersection of different fields and different disciplines. So lots of big conservation challenges have been around for a long time. Lots of progress has been made, but I think we can all look at the scope of the challenges right now around climate, around conservation more broadly, and recognize that we need a set of new approaches. And I see the kind of work that is happening at RARE as like real glimmers of hope around, we know humans are such an important, understanding people and their values and their needs is such an important part of what it will take to shift behaviors around conservation. And really innovative approaches like bringing in behavioral scientists and bringing in designers to try to shape what that next generation of programs and projects and interventions look like is exciting.
Yeah, this sort of walk of entrepreneurial collaboration, right? Bringing in something ostensibly very disparate, design thinking and behavioral science, is at the heart of why RARE Center for Behavior and the Environment exists, right? We are approaching the world's biggest environmental challenges with a different set of tools than have been traditionally deployed by the environmental sector. So for the audience, if you're interested and want to keep being interested and learn more about the BE Center's work, I urge all of you to check out behavior.rare.org. And as Sarah mentioned earlier, the Library of Ambiguity, which is on the Stanford d.school website, is also a great place to start your exploration of all these big, challenging questions. So I know we have a couple of great questions coming in. So let me start with the first one that we have, which I think actually sums up beautifully some of the themes that we've already begun tackling. So the question is, there's a fascinating parallel between the two major changes in the human environment right now, COVID-19 and the racial divide and climate change. And all three are life-changing and will affect us universally, if unevenly, across geography and human groups. So could you comment on that parallel and how design thinking might be applied to this type of situation?
Yeah. I mean, I think one parallel that I see is that, systems produce what they're designed to produce. So where we see, resurgence of the virus, we know we're having this like very live lesson that the kinds of decisions that are happening at the policy level and in communities are producing the kinds of results that we're seeing. And we know that the same thing is true around racial injustice, right? So that for one example, the long history of redlining in terms of like actively segregating where, in particular, Black Americans could buy houses in various cities has created these incredibly unjust situations that are with us today. And those systems were actively designed to do those things. And then when we get to climate, which is the third piece of your question, it's similar. In fact, there was a great piece this morning in the New York Times about the connection between proximity of living near power plants and climate change and temperature rise and adverse outcomes in terms of birth weight and how that disproportionately affects Black women and children. So all of these topics are really connected. So when we think about how do we get better at undesigning those systems, first we have to recognize that there was intent, right, in some cases behind how those systems came to be, where they're not an accident, and that we have to make sure that we are designing in a holistic way to take all of those factors into account. Where I am really hopeful that design and design thinking can play a role is that it can be that common vocabulary that people start to use to tackle these challenges where there aren't clear solutions. So the problems in some cases are very clear. We need to have a better and more holistic understanding of them. And then we need a way to tackle these kinds of challenges from all of these different disciplines. So like a dream team would be a climate justice advocate, somebody who's been really, really active in the Black Lives Matter movement, someone who has an amazing grasp of design process, somebody who really understands the climate science, right? Like I could imagine these really powerful combinations of folks who have expertise from all different lenses, working together in communities to try to tackle some of these major challenges.
Like an interdisciplinary dream team.
Yes, that is my dream in any case.
The second question we have from the audience, I think, pushes you to extrapolate on this a little bit more. So the question goes, how can design thinking be applied to systemic change, be it to healthcare, government, or climate change? And the second part to that is, how does design thinking intersect with behavior change?
So on the behavior change front, I think that design thinking and behavioral science really are these amazing partners that are just starting to learn how to talk to each other. I think that behavioral science has incredibly powerful descriptive models for understanding why humans make the kinds of decisions that they make. And design has the ability to add the lens of, and what are people trying to accomplish? And what is it that's actually important to them? And both of those things are really vital to understand when you're trying to design around behavior change. And then I think design brings a set of tools that is not present yet in behavioral science, around then what do you make? What's the action that you take? What's the thing you create? What are the tests that you run that are about still exploring the possible right answers rather than trying to say like, well, it worked in this study in my lab, it must work in the external world. So I think that these two disciplines are really powerful partners. Related to the question about thinking about systems change, I think one thing that design really offers is, I mean, there are a set of very specific tools around mapping and understanding and really being able to hold together the disparate points of view that might exist across a large system. But there's also a need to get started somewhere. And so I'll give you an example of a group of former students, so alums from the D.school, who have been working now for the past several years with the state of Michigan around redesigning how people get access to the public benefits system. So the state of Michigan, when our alums started this project, had actually the country's longest form that you had to fill out. It was 45 pages long to apply for public benefits. And you could imagine that there might be many, many different places where if you were trying to improve that system that you might start with better training for the employees, you might start on the policy level, but this team of designers really said, let's start with that form. Because actually that form is the intersection between the members of the public who are trying to access their benefits that they're entitled to and the state and the mechanism of the state bureaucracy that's trying to administer those benefits. And so obviously that just changing that form and simplifying it, which they did, is just the beginning, but it creates this point of leverage in the system to bring lots of people together and to start to develop a common goal of improving the system overall. And so often what design can really help with is by creating something tangible and focused that is the place where you start. And all of the other conversations that are happening around that are almost as or even more important than just that one particular project. And that's what we see happening, is that there are now a bunch of changes within that system more broadly that started by identifying this one particular place to dig in.
Yeah, that really resonates with me because, you know, I'm an anthropologist by training, and how we conceptualize citizens' encounters with the state are often precisely in those ephemeral moments like filling up a form, right? Because that's where you experience marginalization, right? The length, the difficulty, perhaps the language, all of those work to compound those experiences of being marginal to systems. So I love that your student managed to hone in on that encounter and then work on changing that. So the question is, how diverse is the D.school's design team, and how the D.school is actively working towards improving some of those questions of representation?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. So there is a really important and powerful conversation happening in design right now that is long overdue. We have been working on, I would say, a broad range of issues related to this for a number of years. And we annually publish all of our kind of diversity statistics in our annual yearbook in terms of our student base and in terms of our instructor and faculty group, and all of that's publicly available on our website. And the thing that I would say is that diversity is just one small piece of the puzzle. It's very important, but the other areas where, as an organization, we have really been working is around inclusion and belonging, as well as equity. And to us, what equity really means is that if you're a student at the D.school and you're a student of color, you're a Black student, you should not feel in a different experience, and you should not have different outcomes educationally than any other student. And that's the bar that we want to hold ourselves to. And we know that because there are so few Black designers in particular, that we need to work much harder to make sure that we are understanding the biases that are a part of the history of design, where design has come from, ways in which our own organization may be unintentionally replicating some of those structures. So this is a very, very serious topic that we work on very actively at the D.school and have for a number of years. The other thing that I'll say is that particularly in our K-12 education work, there is no difference between that work in terms of advancing design and advancing equity. And there is actually a very powerful moment that we have right now because there has been so much disruption within the K-12 space because of the pandemic, to make sure that in the work that we're doing with schools, we are helping them design for equity and not replicate the structures that have created such systemic inequity across our K-12 education system right at this moment. And so that work is something that we are really actively engaged in right now.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing that with candor. Do you have any?
I also want to say it's not enough, right? Like, none of us are doing enough. And that sitting in that tension is the place that we need to be sitting right now. So I'm really proud of the work of our team, and I'm proud of the ways in which we are confronting this issue. And we are on the journey, and we are learning from our colleagues across the space. And really, we learn from our students. And that is a very, very important way that we continue to evolve the organization.
Perfect. Do you have any closing thoughts? I think we are nearing the end of our first rare conversation. So do you want to leave our audience with a last wise nugget that they can carry into the rest of their day?
Well, I would just say that if you, if something in this conversation sparked a desire for you to learn a little bit more about design, we have some great resources. We've talked about it in a very abstract way here. So I'm sure some of you are still like, but what is it exactly? And how might I adopt some of those strategies? So we had planned to release an update to our kind of like introductory learning experience, and then the pandemic hit. So we've completely revisited that. It is now entirely usable, even if you're working with people just through Zoom or some other conferencing mechanism. So that is something we're calling the D.school Starter Kit. And that would just give you a couple of hours of introduction. And it's a really good, extremely low stakes way for you to have a tiny little microcosm experience of ambiguity. So if you want to kind of push your thinking and your own understanding of how you can continue to be creative and continue to work on innovative concepts, even during this time of immense ambiguity and uncertainty, I would recommend that as a place to start.
Well, now that all of you have homework, thank you so much.
I'm sorry, I'm an educator, I can't help it.
I know, exactly. Thank you so much, all of you members of the audience, for joining our very first Rare Conversations. If you enjoyed this, tune in for our next one, which is in the pipeline. And in the meantime, do consider supporting Rare's work to inspire change so people and nature thrive. Thank you, all of you.
Thanks, everyone.